When a frustrated passenger confronts J.D. Vance with biting accusations on a first-class flight, an unexpected conversation unfolds, revealing truths that leave both men and everyone watching forever changed. The morning at Reagan National Airport was a bustle of motion. The faint aroma of coffee from nearby cafes mingled with the whir of suitcases rolling across polished floors. Travelers hurried past one another, their faces etched with varying degrees of urgency. Among them was Elliot Hayes, his presence commanding attention as he strode into the first-class lounge. Elliot wasn't a man easily ignored. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and crisp white shirt, he exuded an air of self-assuredness that bordered on arrogance. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his gold-rimmed glasses glinted under the overhead lights. A venture capitalist with an impressive portfolio, Elliot was no stranger to debates, especially those involving politics, a subject he often approached with unapologetic bluntness. Today, he was particularly irked. The news app on his phone displayed an article featuring Vice President J.D. Vance, highlighting a recent speech on economic reform. To Elliot, the promises sounded hollow, a litany of platitudes wrapped in faux sincerity. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he scrolled through the article. "This guy," Elliot said loudly, pointing his phone screen at no one. "In particular, he talks about the working class like he still lives among them. It's all a performance. He doesn't have a clue what real struggle looks like anymore." A few heads turned, but most passengers chose to keep their attention elsewhere. However, one man, seated quietly with a cup of coffee and a paperback, looked up briefly. He was unremarkable in appearance, wearing a simple grey sweater and jeans, his brown hair slightly disheveled. He appeared engrossed in his book, the cover obscured by his hands. Elliot's voice grew louder as he continued his tirade. "I mean, seriously, how does someone go from writing a sob story about his life in Appalachia to sipping champagne with lobbyists in Washington? It's hypocrisy at its finest." The man in the grey sweater shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. A few passengers glanced at him curiously, perhaps noticing a slight resemblance to the man Elliot was berating, but no one said anything, and the atmosphere grew tense. Elliot, emboldened by the silence around him, turned toward the man with the book. "You've got that look," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Bet you're one of those Ivy League types, too. What do you think about your vice president, huh? Another out-of-touch suit pretending to care." The man lowered his book slowly, revealing a calm but piercing gaze. "Actually," he said in a measured tone, "I think he tries to do his best under difficult circumstances." The lounge fell silent. Elliot blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected response. He narrowed his eyes, studying the man more closely. Recognition dawned, and his face hardened. "You've got to be kidding me," Elliot said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're him, J.D. Vance." Vance smiled faintly, setting his book on the table beside him. "Guilty as charged," he said, his tone light. "I'm just trying to catch a flight like everyone else." Elliot folded his arms, leaning back against a nearby counter. "Well, this is perfect," he said. "Since I've got you here, why don't you explain how you plan to fix the mess you've made? Or do you only answer questions when cameras are rolling?" Vance regarded Elliot thoughtfully, his expression calm despite the antagonistic tone. "I'm happy to hear your concerns," he said. "It sounds like you have a lot on your mind." "Oh, don't give me that," Elliot shot back. "You politicians are all the same. You sell us these grand visions of change, but when it comes down to it, you're more concerned with pleasing donors than helping real people." Vance leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I understand why you'd feel that way," he said. "Politics can be frustrating, and it's easy to lose trust when promises aren't kept. But I assure you, my goal has always been to make a real difference, not just talk about it." Elliot scoffed. "Sure, and what difference have you made? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've forgotten where you came from." The tension in the room was palpable. Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange, their coffee cups and magazines momentarily forgotten. A young woman near the corner whispered something to her companion, who nodded subtly. Vance met Elliot's gaze steadily. "I haven't forgotten," he said, his voice firm but devoid of anger. "I grew up in a place where people felt abandoned by their leaders, where opportunities were few and struggles were many. That's why I ran for office, to fight for the people who raised me, who believed in me when no one else did." Elliot opened his mouth to retort, but paused, momentarily thrown off balance by the sincerity in Vance's voice. He quickly recovered. "Words are cheap," he said. "Actions matter more, and I'm not seeing the kind of action we need." Vance nodded slowly. "You're right. Words alone aren't enough. That's why I've been working on legislation to address the opioid crisis, to improve access to education and job training. It's not perfect, and there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm committed to making progress." The conversation was interrupted by the lounge attendant announcing that boarding for the flight to Cincinnati had begun. Vance stood, picking up his book and coat. "I'd be happy to continue this conversation on the plane," he said, his tone friendly. "It sounds like you have valuable insights, and I'd like to hear more." Elliot hesitated, caught between his frustration and a grudging respect for Vance's composure. "Fine," he said at last, grabbing his bag, "but don't think for a second that I'm going to go easy on you." Vance smiled faintly. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said, as they joined the line of passengers heading to the gate. The narrow jet bridge echoed with footsteps and the hum of distant engines as passengers boarded the flight from Washington, D.C. to Cincinnati. Elliot Hayes walked briskly, his leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Vice President J.D. Vance followed a few steps behind, his movements unhurried, his face calm. First-class passengers began settling into their wide seats, stowing bags and accepting glasses of sparkling water from the flight attendants. Elliot had secured a seat in the first row, giving him a commanding view of the cabin. He adjusted his seatbelt with an air of defiance, glancing toward the back where Vance was taking his seat quietly in the third row. The proximity irritated Elliot, as though fate had conspired to prolong his encounter with the vice president. Elliot leaned back, scanning the cabin. A middle-aged couple seated across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes flickering. Between him and Vance, another passenger, a sharply dressed woman in her 30s, appeared engrossed in a book, though her occasional glances suggested she was eavesdropping. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the hum of conversation quieted. The attendant's safety demonstration filled the cabin with a practiced monotony. Elliot fidgeted impatiently, his mind replaying the earlier exchange in the lounge. He wasn't done with J.D. Vance. Not yet. The seatbelt sign dinged off as the flight reached cruising altitude. Passengers began adjusting their trays, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Elliot didn't wait for an opening. He turned in his seat, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the cabin noise. "Well, Mr. Vice President," he began, his tone sharp, "you said you wanted to continue the conversation. Let's talk. Tell me, how do you justify bailing out corporations while families like the ones you grew up with are still struggling?" Heads turned. Vance, who had been reading, lowered his book and looked at Elliot. His expression remained composed, though his eyes carried a hint of weariness. "It's not as simple as that," Vance replied. "Supporting businesses during an economic downturn can prevent layoffs and stabilize communities. The goal is to protect jobs, not corporations." Elliot snorted. "That's a nice soundbite, but it doesn't help when the people at the top pocket bonuses while workers are left with scraps. Don't tell me you don't see the hypocrisy in that." Vance leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on his knees. His voice was calm but firm. "I do see it, Elliot. That's why I've pushed for legislation to hold corporations accountable for how they use federal aid. Transparency and oversight are crucial, and we've made strides in ensuring those measures are in place. The use of his first name caught Elliot off guard, momentarily softening his combative stance, but his frustration quickly returned. You can legislate all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that people are hurting. My cousin lost her house last year because her medical bills piled up. Where was the help for her? Vance's expression shifted, a flicker of empathy crossing his face. I'm sorry to hear that. Medical debt is a huge issue, and it's one I've been working to address. We've expanded healthcare subsidies and capped out-of-pocket expenses for many families. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a step in the right direction. Elliot waved his hand dismissively. Steps, that's all we ever hear. Meanwhile, people are drowning and you're handing out life vests one at a time. A quiet voice interrupted the exchange. Excuse me, said the sharply dressed woman, seated near Elliot. She leaned slightly into the aisle, her expression apologetic yet firm. I don't mean to intrude, but I think you're being unfair. Elliot turned toward her, surprised. Unfair? The woman nodded. Yes, I don't know your cousin's situation, and I'm sorry for what she's been through, but I do know that the vice president has worked hard on initiatives that have helped people like my brother. She paused, glancing at Vance before continuing. My brother struggled with addiction for years. He got hooked on opioids after a car accident. It nearly destroyed our family, but thanks to programs funded by the administration, he was able to get into a treatment center. He's been clean for 2 years now. The cabin fell silent. Elliot stared at her, his arguments momentarily silenced by the rawness of her words. Vance gave her a small nod, gratitude evident in his expression. That's why I do what I do, Vance said quietly, breaking the silence. It's not about headlines or approval ratings. It's about real people, families like yours, Elliot, and hers. I know progress can feel slow, but every person we help makes the fight worth it. Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The sincerity in Vance's voice, combined with the woman's testimony, had begun to chip away at his certainty. Still, his frustration lingered. And what about the ones you don't help? Elliot asked, his voice softer but still resolute. What about the people who fall through the cracks? Vance hesitated, his expression thoughtful. That's the hardest part, he admitted. Knowing we can't reach everyone, at least not right away, but it doesn't mean we stop trying. Every policy, every program, it's a step towards something better, and if there's a way to improve, I want to hear about it. The sincerity in his words hung in the air, a quiet challenge. Elliot found himself unsure how to respond. The plane jolted slightly as it hit a pocket of turbulence, breaking the tension. The flight attendant arrived with coffee and refreshments, offering Elliot a cup. He accepted it absent-mindedly, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The man he had written off as another out-of-touch politician was proving to be more nuanced, more human than he had expected. As the plane cruised on, Elliot sat back in his seat, sipping his coffee. He wasn't ready to concede his arguments, but for the first time he wondered if perhaps there was more to J.D. Vance than the headlines suggested. The plane's cabin hummed with quiet conversation and the faint rustle of newspapers. A gentle vibration from the engines created a steady rhythm, but the tension between Elliot Hayes and Vice President J.D. Vance remained palpable. Elliot was trying to reconcile the man sitting a few rows away, calm, measured, and surprisingly candid, with the image of a politician he had long criticized. The flight attendant returned with a second round of refreshments. As she poured a cup of tea for the older woman seated near Vance, she glanced at the vice president. "Thank you for everything you've done," she said softly. Her voice, though barely audible to others, carried genuine emotion. Vance smiled warmly. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. Elliot watched the brief exchange, his jaw tightening. He leaned toward the aisle. "You know," he began, loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's easy to look good on a plane. You're not exactly solving the country's problems from seat 3A. A few passengers glanced nervously at each other, sensing the rising tension. Vance looked up from his book and met Elliot's gaze. "I'm not solving them from here," he said evenly, "but that doesn't mean I'm not working to make things better. Sometimes the best solutions come from conversations like this." Elliot scoffed. "Is that what this is? A conversation? Feels more like damage control to me." A voice spoke from the back of the cabin. "Maybe you should let him finish," said a man in his early 40s, wearing a polo shirt and jeans. He leaned forward in his seat, his expression a mix of irritation and curiosity. "You've been throwing punches since we boarded. Why don't you let the guy talk?" Elliot turned, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you, his press secretary?" The man shrugged. "No, just someone tired of people yelling without listening." The atmosphere shifted. A few passengers nodded subtly, emboldened by the man's interruption. Elliot hesitated, realizing he was losing the crowd's sympathy. He turned back to Vance, gesturing for him to speak. "Fine, go ahead. Enlighten me." Vance set his book aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Elliot," he began, his tone steady, "I'm not here to change your mind about me, but I'd like to share a little about why I do what I do." He paused, as though gathering his thoughts. "I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My family didn't have much, and like a lot of people in Appalachia, we faced our share of challenges. Addiction, unemployment, broken homes. It was all part of the fabric of our lives. For years, I was angry. I blamed the system, the politicians, even my own family." Vance's voice softened, and the cabin seemed to lean in. "But then I realized something. Anger alone doesn't solve anything. If I wanted things to change, I had to be part of the solution. That's why I wrote my book, why I ran for office. Not because I have all the answers, but because I believe we can do better if we work together." Elliot's expression remained skeptical. "Nice story," he said. "But how does that translate to actual policy? Talking about your past doesn't pay anyone's medical bills or put food on the table." Before Vance could respond, another passenger spoke up. It was the older woman who had been quietly sipping her tea. "It's not just talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My grandson wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the programs the vice president fought for." All eyes turned to her. She adjusted her glasses, her hands shaking as she set her cup down. "2 years ago, my grandson overdosed on opioids. He was only 19. We didn't think he'd survive, but he got into a treatment program that saved his life. That program was funded by the policies this administration pushed for." Her voice cracked, and she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I don't know about politics," she continued, "but I know what it feels like to get a second chance, and I'll always be grateful for that." Elliot shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of her words settling over him. The cabin was silent except for the soft hum of the engines. Vance turned to the woman, his expression filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for sharing that," he said gently. The man in the polo shirt spoke again. "You know, Elliot, you're not wrong to be frustrated. A lot of us are. But maybe it's worth considering that not everything's as black and white as it seems." Elliot opened his mouth to reply, but stopped. The anger that had fueled him for so long felt misplaced in the face of these stories. He looked at Vance, who met his gaze with steady resolve. "I still think you could do more," Elliot said finally, his tone less combative. "There are too many people falling through the cracks. You can't expect us to wait while the system figures itself out." Vance nodded. "You're right, we can't afford to wait. That's why I'm always looking for ways to improve, new ideas, better solutions. I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to listen to anyone who does, including you." cabin settled into a contemplative silence. Elliot leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed, but his expression was no longer hostile. He glanced out the window at the clouds below, his thoughts racing. For the first time, he wondered if he had been too quick to judge. Maybe Vance wasn't just another politician spouting empty promises. Maybe there was more to him, a genuine desire to make a difference, even if the results weren't perfect. As the plane flew on toward Cincinnati, Elliot remained quiet, his mind churning with questions he wasn't sure how to articulate. The confrontation had shifted from a battle of wills to something deeper, a moment of reflection and the possibility of understanding. The plane began its descent into Cincinnati. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the weather and estimated time of arrival. Elliot Hayes sat back in his seat, his arms crossed, but the tension in his posture had softened. The earlier confrontations had left him with more questions than answers, and for the first time in years, his anger felt less like a weapon and more like a burden. J.D. Vance closed his book and tucked it into the seat-back pocket in front of him. He glanced toward Elliot, sensing the shift in his demeanor. It wasn't victory he felt, but something quieter, perhaps the first glimmer of mutual understanding. As the plane leveled out for its final approach, the woman who had shared her grandson's story leaned toward Elliot. "You seem like someone who cares a lot," she said softly. "That's not a bad thing, but sometimes anger can blind us to the good that's being done." Elliot gave her a small, polite nod, though her words stung. "It's not anger," he replied after a moment. "It's frustration. It feels like no matter how hard people like me fight, nothing really changes." The man in the polo shirt, seated a few rows back, chimed in again. "Change takes time," he said, leaning forward. "It's not perfect and it's definitely not fast, but it's there. My wife runs a food pantry in our neighborhood. You'd be surprised how much funding for things like that has increased in the last few years. It's not enough, but it helps." Elliot turned to him, his brows furrowing. A food pantry shouldn't have to exist in the first place. People deserve stability, not charity. The man nodded. "You're right, but until the system catches up, we do what we can." Vance spoke then, his voice measured. "Elliot, I understand your frustration. I've felt it myself. But here's the thing. If we only focus on what's broken, we miss the chance to build something better. Change doesn't happen in sweeping gestures. It happens in small, deliberate steps. And those steps often start with conversations like this one." Elliot considered his words, his defenses wavering. For so long he had carried his anger like a shield, convinced that shouting louder was the only way to be heard. But now, surrounded by strangers who shared stories of both struggle and resilience, he began to see the limits of his approach. The plane's wheels touched down with a jolt, and a ripple of relieved murmurs spread through the cabin. The flight. Attendants moved quickly to prepare for disembarkation, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. As the plane taxied to the gate, Elliot turned to Vance. "You really think conversations like this matter?" he asked, his tone tinged with skepticism. Vance smiled faintly. "They're a start. I've learned more from listening to people than from any report or briefing, and I think you have a lot to say that's worth hearing." The sincerity in his voice caught Elliot off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but the moment was interrupted by the ding of the seatbelt sign turning off. Passengers stood, stretching and reaching for their bags in the overhead bins. Elliot grabbed his duffel and slung it over his shoulder, stepping into the aisle. Vance, unhurried, waited his turn to disembark. As Elliot moved toward the exit, he paused, glancing back at the vice president. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than before. "If you really mean that, about listening, I'm willing to talk, maybe over coffee sometime." Vance's expression brightened, and he extended a hand. "I'd like that. Let's set it up." Elliot hesitated before shaking his hand, a small gesture that felt monumental in its simplicity. The bustling terminal was a stark contrast to the confined space of the plane. Travelers hurried past, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Elliot walked toward the baggage claim, his mind still replaying the events of the flight. He felt disoriented, as though his worldview had been nudged ever so slightly. "Of course!" a voice called out behind him. "Elliot!" He turned to see the man in the polo shirt jogging to catch up. "I just wanted to say you've got guts," the man said, slightly out of breath. "It's not easy to call out someone in power, even if I didn't agree with how you went about it." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment or a critique?" The man chuckled. "Maybe a bit of both. But seriously, if you care that much, maybe you should channel it into something more constructive. Join a local advocacy group. Write op-eds. Hell, run for office yourself." Elliot blinked, taken aback. "Me in politics? Why not?" The man said with a shrug. "You've got passion. That's more than a lot of people can say." Elliot watched as the man disappeared into the crowd, his words lingering. Run for office? The idea seemed absurd, and yet something about it resonated. As Elliot retrieved his luggage and walked toward the parking lot, he spotted Vance standing near an exit, surrounded by aides and security. Their eyes met briefly, and Vance gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience. Elliot nodded back, a small but significant gesture. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not blind optimism, but the kind of cautious hope that comes from realizing that even in a divided world, understanding was still possible. The crisp winter air of Cincinnati hit Elliot Hayes as he stepped out of the terminal. He zipped his jacket, his duffel slung over one shoulder. The conversation on the plane replayed in his mind, each word, each moment of vulnerability, reshaping the way he saw not just J.D. Vance but himself. He had spent years railing against the system, shouting into a void he believed no one in power truly cared to fill. But something about this day, the vice president's candor, the stories shared by strangers, had planted a seed of doubt in his rigid convictions. Could change be slower and messier than he wanted, but still worth fighting for? Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a message from his cousin Bethany, the one who had lost her home to medical debt. She was working late again, trying to rebuild her life piece by piece. Elliot stared at the screen, a pang of guilt washing over him. He had always spoken on her behalf, but when was the last time he'd asked what she needed? He typed back, "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Let's grab coffee soon. I want to hear what's going on and how I can help." Bethany's reply came quickly. She said, "Wow, thanks, Elle. That means a lot. Let's set something up this weekend." Elliot put his phone away, his steps slower now, more deliberate. He realized he had spent so much time fighting against things that he had forgotten how to fight for the people who mattered most. Elliot sat at a corner table in a bustling cafe, sipping a steaming mug of black coffee. He tapped his foot nervously, waiting for J.D. Vance to arrive. True to his word, the vice president had followed up on their conversation, arranging this meeting through his staff. When Vance walked in, wearing a simple blazer and jeans, he drew little attention. He scanned the room, spotted Elliot, and made his way over. "Elliot," Vance greeted, extending a hand. "Thanks for meeting me." Elliot stood and shook his hand, gesturing for him to sit. "Honestly, I wasn't sure you'd follow through," he admitted. Vance chuckled, setting his coat over the back of the chair. "A lot of people say that. I'm glad you gave me the chance to prove you wrong." The two men ordered their drinks, another black coffee for Elliot and a tea for Vance. When the server left, Vance leaned forward, his demeanor relaxed but focused. "I've been thinking about what you said," Vance began, "about the people falling through the cracks. It's something I think about every day, and I'd like to hear more about your perspective. What do you think we're missing?" Elliot blinked, caught off guard. He had prepared for another debate, but Vance's openness threw him. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think, I think people like me, like my family, we're tired of being told to wait, Elliot said. We're told that progress takes time, but that doesn't help when you're losing your house or when your kid can't see a doctor. It's hard to believe in the system when it feels so far away from your reality. Vance nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I hear you. And you're right. People shouldn't have to wait for help when they're struggling. That's why I'm trying to make federal programs more localized, more responsive. But it's a balancing act. The bureaucracy slows things down, and change doesn't always come as quickly as we want. Elliot leaned forward, his voice growing more animated. Then why not bypass the bureaucracy? Fund grassroots organizations directly. Support the people who are already in these communities, who know what the problems are and how to solve them. Vance smiled, a genuine expression of interest. That's a good point. And we've started experimenting with that approach in a few pilot programs, but I'd love to hear your ideas on how to expand it. For the next hour, the two men talked, their conversation shifting from policy to personal stories and back again. Elliot found himself surprised at how much he and Vance had in common, how both had seen the cracks in the system up close, though from different vantage points. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow through the cafe's windows, Vance glanced at his watch. I should get going, he said, standing and extending his hand again. Elliot, this has been one of the most productive conversations I've had in a long time. Let's keep it going. Elliot shook his hand, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, let's. The room was packed. Folding chairs filled the community center, and a small podium stood at the front. Elliot adjusted his tie nervously, glancing out at the crowd. This wasn't his usual audience of friends or co-workers. It was neighbors, activists, and local leaders, and J.D. Vance, seated in the front row, watching with quiet encouragement. Elliot took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. Good evening, he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. My name is Elliot Hayes, and I'm here because I believe we can do better for our community. For too long, we've been told to wait for change. Well, I say it's time we make change happen ourselves. The crowd applauded, and Elliot felt a swell of determination. He spoke about local issues, healthcare, housing, and education, and the need for grassroots solutions. He shared his vision of a community where everyone had a voice, where no one was left behind. As he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. Elliot stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with attendees and feeling for the first time that his frustration had found a purpose. Vance approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You've got something special, Elliot, he said. Keep going. You're making a difference. Elliot nodded, his heart pounding. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Not just for himself, but for the people he had long fought to defend.